Book 2, we just finished Words of Radiance, the second book in the Stormlight Archive, and dang, we loved that book.
It is a wild ride from the beginning to the end, and it's like you just came out of Way of Kings, we just read it, and now Words of Radiance just hit you in the face.
Oh man, I will tell you, man, this book is not a second book. This is a Sanderlanche to book 1.
A lot of people feel the same. Like, there's so many people that commented on our first video from Way of Kings and are telling us that Words of Radiance is hands down better. And
yeah.
How many times do you see a sequel that's better than the original? I don't think that hardly ever happens.
It's amazing. And the reason why was exactly what I'm saying, is it's not a second book. It just feels like part 2 of the first book. It's just every single moment is intense. You're on the edge of your seat the whole time. I have literally never been on the edge of my seat for so long. This book is like almost 50 hours. That's exhausting.
Every single part, you're like blown away by something new. Everyone's storyline, like you feel like these books get confusing, right? There's a lot of characters, we'll talk more about what we think about characters and plot and whatnot in a part of our review, but when you get into every single character that can just explode their own story and just make it massive, it's unbelievable. Because it happens with every single character we met in the first book is now like, oh, and what's this person working on? What's this person up to? And oh my goodness, I can't believe that happened to them. Yeah. It's crazy the whole way.
And it's just what you're saying is like you've built up a love for all of these characters in book 1.
Yeah.
But now you get to see the interactions of all the characters
grow,
in book 2.
And they go through crazy stuff.
Yeah.
It's awesome. I think you're right that it's basically the Sanderlanche to part 1, which is Way of Kings. And this is like, it just blows my mind that everyone seems to think that this book is better than the first book.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I'm just going to straight up say it. And which is crazy because, spoiler alert, I rated the first book a 10 out of 10.
I know. I had no idea how you were going to go up from that. So
I know. You were definitely rating the first one with this next book in mind, weren't you?
I was, absolutely.
I should have done that. What was I thinking? Does that knock down the review of the first book for me from a 10 down to like a 9.8 or 9.9?
The point of these reviews is that you give a number and then you can also give some feedback. So maybe it can be fudged a little bit. But we'll talk about our final numbers right at the end.
Yeah. But before we get there, though, I want to know from you, why is this book better than book 1 for you?
I think, okay, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning. I think the main reason that this book is better for me is because I was more invested in it. I think it takes a little bit of time to get into Way of Kings. I mentioned this in our other review. Takes some time. There's the intro chapters. You're maybe 10 hours in before you're like, I actually know what the heck's going on.
I get it, yeah.
But this book, you start page 1 and you're like, I know what's going on. And this is craziness. Like, stuff happens in the first chapter and you're like, whoa. I did not see that coming in any sense. I think that happens throughout the entire book. I think you're constantly going through bombshell after bombshell of plot points. And I think that they're just throwing characters around.
Oh man, it's so crazy to think back to the beginning of this book because you're right. So we're going to have some spoilers in this book, in this review, just so you know, coming forward. But This book starts with Yasna being assassinated.
The assassination.
What a massive way to start a book. You don't have normal authors writing massive parts of that in the very beginning of a book.
There's not like an intro to kind of warm into the story, which is why you said, I think, a long time ago in a way long ago episode, that it's like, you just feel like they're all one book. Yeah, like it just continues straight in.
Yeah.
And I don't know how long between when these books were published, but it's like, it literally could have been the same manuscript that he just divided in half. He's like, look, I can't write a 2,000-page book.
If Sanderson were your typical author, Yasna, that part with Yasna would have been moved into the end of Way of Kings book 1 because that's a great cliffhanger. But he put it at the beginning, and that doesn't get resolved until the end of the book. It's just really masterfully
we talk
done.
about the fact that we love how much happens in these books, but how do you feel about how long it is? Do you feel like it's too long? Like, these books are crazy long, and one of the main reasons the people that I talk to are like, oh, I'm probably not going to read that, like a little too much to take on. It's like 1,000 pages long. Yeah. How do you feel about that?
Honestly, I feel like the book's not long enough. I don't know, it's a hot take, but there's not very many books that can just keep you like wanting more and more. Yeah. And that's why you look forward to the next books, right? Because you're like I just got to know more. I got to know what happens.
That's exactly why I asked the question. Because I think as far as like value to pages in Words of Radiance is significantly better than Way of Kings.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that.
Because they're very
100%.
similar lengths, but I think the way that it fills the pages, Words of Radiance, is amazing. Because even at the beginning, you got things that blow your mind. All the way through, you're like, that's the craziest scene I've ever seen. I think one of the scenes right in the middle, one of the duels, is the best scene that I've read in the entire Stormlight Archive. And it's just right in the middle of the book.
You're talking about the duel with Adolin when he versus the 4 shard bearers. I always think it's 3 for some reason. Then it blows my mind again every time I read it. It was 4.
It's insane. That whole scene, just the power that he writes with. There's some cool wit stories in the book. It's just, there's something in every single part of this book that will blow your mind. And that is exactly the type of book I want to read, even if it's 1,000 pages long.
And it's not even just the action scenes in this book. It's the scenes with all of the mental, moral dilemmas that people have. Especially Kaladin. Because he's gone through these horrible events in his life that he's trying to come up with some sort of an answer, restitution for it.
Revenge, honestly.
Revenge, yeah.
Think about Moash. He's like competing in these like 2 different stories. Both of them have horrible histories and people were murdered. But it's like, how do you react to that? And the whole book becomes this like case study in what do you do in a terrible moral situation? What do you do when you've given your word to 2 different people? What do you do when it's a constant battle of, I don't know what I would do in this situation.
And the answer is you don't kill people.
General rule. That's what I learned from this book, actually.
Don't do that.
Learn something from every book, I say.
This one, don't kill people.
I like one of the elements as far as we're talking about character development and like dilemmas and stuff. One of the things is not a straight path for anyone involved. Think about like Shallan had to deal with the assassination of her teacher. She had to deal with the fact that she was basically kidnapped. She goes through all these things to try and finally make it to the final, like the Shattered Plains where she could get married. Hopefully, maybe. Doesn't even happen in this book. But I think like Kaladin as well. He's not just learning and learning and learning and getting better. That's like such a standard path of a hero. He like learns, loses all his powers, basically thinks he's going to die.
Takes several steps backwards. Yeah.
And that's so much more real of a development of a person and a character. And you can really, I think, connect so much more, relate, I guess you would say, with these characters a lot better when you're like, man, that stinks. Like he just working for all this stuff. He really thought he was something and lost all his powers.
Isn't it amazing that you can relate with characters who live in a magical world and have magic powers?
That's a good point, actually.
It's amazing. Sanderson writes, this is one of the reasons why this book is so good. He is just masterful, and I use that word a lot for his writing because he is, at writing characters that are so real and so relatable. And you're able to just see why, just relate it to your own life. It's just phenomenal. Every single character you're learning from, you're learning real things about leadership and life and just relationships. It's just cool.
And that changes over time with these characters. Like you can love a character at the beginning and by the end you're like, I don't know if I like that guy. Or there's characters like Taravangian's a good example where you're like, I don't know if I like this guy, but man, what an interesting story.
I know, right? Fascinating. And then you even see the characters who take the opposite paths. We've talked about this in the past with Moash and Kaladin having a very similar origins, but then they both take separate paths. Moash decides to commit to the path of revenge, even to the point where he almost kills Kaladin and over it. His friend, the friend who saved his life. Yeah. And then Kaladin takes the other path of honor and saves the king and decides that it's the more honorable and right thing to do.
Again, I mentioned the path thing because character development is huge in a story, plot development, all that stuff. But like, they don't even just take these paths. It's like Moash goes on this side, Kaladin, and then he kind of like comes a little this way, and then he's back over again. Yeah, like it's every moment they're making different decisions that lead them on different paths and lead them to different situations they have to deal with, and it just feels like you don't know what situation they're going to be put in, either by the situation that exists as the book moves forward, or based on the decisions that they make or other characters make for them. Because some characters influence each other, which I think is cool. I mean, obviously, Adolin and Kaladin kind of have this like rivalry the entire time.
So fun.
And it's just fun to see how they're both leaders, very much so. But they do it so differently.
Yep. And even the whole world building is another thing that I love in this book, is he continues to build on what we've already learned. Yeah. And so you realize like, wow, like Kaladin like really can be like Zeth, but like how in the world is he going to get a shard blade? He just gets his own. but not only is it just a blade, like he can turn it into cool stuff at the same time.
It's so much better. It's a living blade.
Yeah.
But it's really, I think, you mentioned the world building. I want to talk about that because it gets more complex. And my favorite thing about Brandon Sanderson is that there's pieces in book 1 that you didn't even know were like hidden in there. As soon as you learn how it actually works in book 2, you're like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That guy.
He was there the whole time.
Yeah, and these little parts. And we're doing a reread, obviously, kind of prepare for book 5 coming out. And you get to pick up on a lot more of that stuff. You're like, oh man, he snuck that in there. And you have no idea. You just read right past it.
Yeah. Is there any particular example that you can think of off the top of your head?
I think a lot of the Stormlight stuff, a lot of the backstories for like Shallan and others. I don't know how much of like a reverse spoiler we want to do.
Yeah.
But like you get to see a lot of these people's backstories. You're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But then here you're like, oh, that's why that happened that way. Like
that's why it's
it makes
so much
a lot
trauma.
More sense. Yeah. And like how they could do certain things or couldn't do certain other things. It just leads into now they've become this hero or this radiant. And it's awesome. I think it's so cool.
Oh, hi, dude. I love all that.
And it only gets better from here, right? Like, there's 2 more books that we have to read.
I can't wait. So we're going to do a rating of this.
Yes, the final rating.
But before we do the rating, this is kind of goes with the rating, is would you recommend this to your average reader? Like to...
yes.
Okay.
I wholeheartedly would recommend this. And I it's a good question because I think I was on the fence with Way of Kings. Yeah. I was like, I would only recommend it kind of if they've already read Mistborn, they're kind of already involved in Sanderson. I think Words of Radiance, I would probably recommend to anyone who's read, obviously, the first book.
Anyone who's read The Way of Kings, definitely recommend reading the second book.
But it's almost like I would dangle the second book in front of them, like, you have to get through the first book so you can read this amazing book that's even better. And use that as a way to recommend Way of Kings even more because this book is so good.
I love how you say that because I have told that to friends many times. So I'm like, you're going to read The Way of Kings. It's going to start slow. By the end of that book, you're going to love it. Yeah. But that book is going to end in a way. So it's funny because you're trying to convince them to read a 45-hour book. And
2
it's
of
funny,
them.
and unbelievably, at the very end of that 45-hour book, you're going to say, I have to read the next book starting tomorrow. Because that ends so well in Way of Kings. Yeah. And you have to know what happens next. And
you can't stop at any point during the second book.
And then you can't stop. And that's why you're exhausted by the end of the second book. Because like you've been on the edge of your seat for the entire book. It's just so good.
It is. And so does that give you a rating? Do you know what you would rate this book?
Yes. I pretty much said at the beginning. This is a 10. This book is a 10. I think it is written really well by Sanderson. I think it's clear. It's an exciting story. I think that the characters feel very real to me. There's exciting events throughout the entire book. There's a reason why this book is, I think, the highest rated book on Goodreads because it's just enjoyable. Every single moment of that book is just a lot of fun. And you just have fun when you're reading that. I laughed out loud in so many parts of this book, just with the interactions between Kaladin and Adolin and Xyle. Like it's just awesome. What would you say?
I completely agree with you, and I do not like giving out perfect scores. So I was thinking about like, I could give it like 9.7 or 9.8, still better than Way of Kings. I think I'm just gonna straight up give it a 10.
A 10 from Jaden.
It's interesting. The Way of Kings I think got a 9.4 from me. Yeah. I guess that spoils it if you haven't read that review, but I'm gonna have to go straight to 10. It's that good. I know there are books that I've probably read that I would also rate as a 10.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that they're better inherently than this book. It's just so good. So I think, right out the gate, we have a book that is a perfect 10 from the 2 of us.
And a 10 plus 10 divided by 2 is an average of 10.
Exactly right.
We did it.
Well done.
That's math that you can confidently do on camera.
Which means we're definitely recommending this book to friends. Like we talked about anything above a 7 is a recommend. But a 10 is like, you're going around the streets telling people about this book.
You're an evangelist at this point. You're going around, and this is what I've turned into. This is why Sanderson fans are like made fun of all the time because they read these books and then they're all of a sudden holding knives to all their friends' throats and saying like, you have to read this book right now. It's because you can't just experience this on your own. Yeah, it's just so good, and you're just so it's just provided such an amazing experience that you want everyone to experience the same thing as you.
So if you haven't read Words of Radiance, and you're looking for a recommendation to read, 100%, 10 out of 10, would recommend. Check it out. You have to.
It's a phenomenal book. And last question for you. Would you recommend reading The Way of Kings before reading Mistborn? Because you think it's the best books you've ever read.
Yep.
Would you still recommend reading Mistborn first?
I would, depending on the person. If you're going to take some time to get into 40... If you're a person that reads a lot, straight into Way of Kings, no problems.
Yeah.
If you're someone that's like trying to get into reading, start with Mistborn. Yep. I think that's my straight up recommendation.
I would agree with that. I would also say if you're someone who doesn't usually do fantasy, I would also say start with Mistborn.
Yeah,
just because
I like
it's
that.
a little bit easier way to test it.
Faster paced. Yep.
Also, phenomenal books. It honestly took until the second book of Way of Kings, or of the Stormlight Archive.
Oof,
I know.
Was
It took me until I finished Words of Radiance from the first time I was reading these books to decide that I liked Way of Kings better than Mistborn.
Oh.
It was the second book that did it for me. And
It's a powerful book. So the review
good.
speaks for itself.
Yeah.
We have nothing but fantastic things to say about it. Both rating it 10 out of 10.
We recommend it. Go tell everyone you know to read it. We'll do the same.
If they don't believe that it's the best book ever, just send them this video.
Yeah.
That'll convince them.
We'll spoil half of it for them, but they won't even remember by the time they read the first book. It's all these words won't make sense to them. They'll just see our enthusiasm and they'll be like,
exactly.
Yes.
So send them the video. They will watch it and then they'll read the book and you'll be able to chat with them about it.
It'll be
what
great.
It's all about.
It'll be great.
Well, thanks for joining us. This is our review of Words of Radiance, and we do tons of these. So if you haven't seen our other videos and want to, check out the channel, subscribe if you're interested.
We are preparing for Wind and Truth, so watch our upcoming videos.
Get prepared with us. See you guys next time.